Supercar, the Avalanche. The glistening, snow-capped peaks of the Swiss mountains reached up to touch the clear blue sky as Supercar swept in like a graceful bird towards the gaily painted cottage where Professor Popkiss had spent his youth.
"It's good to be home after so long an absence, Mike,"
chuckled the professor. He had been excited as a 10-year-old boy when Mike Mercury had agreed to make the trip to Switzerland for a holiday.
"Shall we land beside the cottage, Prof?"
Mike asked, glancing down at the snow-covered roof of the picturesque house that lay in the shadows of the towering peaks.
"Yes, please, Mike,"
said Popkiss, gazing happily down at the building that brought memories of his childhood flooding back to his mind.
"But you had better cut the engines to a minimum. The slightest sudden noise could start an avalanche."
"Gee, sure," Mike said. "I've heard about these avalanches in the valleys. Can they really be caused by a mere shout or stamp of the foot?"
Yes,
broke in Dr. Beaker, who was sitting beside Jimmy and Mitch in the rear seat of the Wonder Machine.
"That is quite correct. Noise causes vibrations, and the movement can dislodge the top snow."
"Then wango, eh?" exclaimed Mike, clapping his hands to emphasize the point. "The whole caboodle starts to fall." Supercar's engines died to a gentle whisper as Mike brought the sleek craft down on a vertical landing to the soft, crisp snow near the cottage. With a sigh, the car's mighty motors cut to silence, and Mike slid back the cockpit roof. "Your sister, Heidi, came back to live here some months ago, didn't she, Prof?" Mike asked as he climbed to the white ground.
"Yes, Mike,"
answered Professor Popkiss, and before he could continue, the door of the cottage opened and a beaming face appeared around the edge of the door.
"Aunt Heidi,"
called Jimmy as he ran happily towards the present old lady.
"It sure is good to see you again."
Quickly, the team's luggage was carried from Supercar into the delightful cottage, and it was not long before everyone was sitting down eating a nourishing meal.
"Do you remember Kurt Gessler, your old employer at the clock shop?"
Heidi asked the professor as they ate.
"Do I remember him?"
exclaimed Popkiss.
"Why, he taught me a great deal about delicate machinery. He is one of the finest clockmakers in the world." "That's right,"
agreed Heidi.
"And still he has a little shop down in the village."
"Well," smiled Mike, selecting one of Heidi's delicious cakes. "I'd sure like to meet Mr. Gessler, Prof."
"And so you shall, Mike,"
beamed Professor Popkiss.
"We'll all go down into the village right after we've finished our meal." "All except Dr. Beaker, I guess."
Jimmy laughed, and all glanced at the forgetful scientist, who was sleeping soundly, his chin resting on his chest.
"It's the mountain air,"
informed Heidi Popkiss.
"It is very pure and is inclined to make one drowsy."
Leaving Beaker in Heidi's tender care, Mike, Popkiss and Jimmy each took a sledge from the cottage woodshed, and soon they were tobogganing down the steep valley floor towards the village that lay below. Mitch chattered happily behind Jimmy as the boy tried to steer a straight course, but sledging at speed Jimmy found was not at all easy. By the time they reached the edge of the beautiful village, all had suffered a number of mishaps, but the snow was soft, and the few bruises they received only served to add to the enjoyment of the trip. They found Kurt Gessler's shop and entered the tiny log-walled building. 100 clocks ticked noisily at them from all around the first room they came to. Cuckoo clocks, weather clocks, grandfather clocks, clocks in glass cases. Every type of clock was on display, competing with each other, it seemed, to make a louder tick than the next. "I'd sure hate being here when 12 o'clock comes round," joked Mike. "I bet the noise of cuckoos and chimes is deafening."
"You get used to it eventually,"
smiled Popkiss.
"Come on, Kurt is probably in his workshop."
Popkiss led Mike, Jimmy and Mitch to a door behind the small glass-topped counter. Beyond the door they saw a fully equipped machine workshop which contained even more clocks and timepieces. Working at a stout wooden bench was a white-bearded old man of 80 or more years. As they entered, he smiled up at them, a smile full of warmth and welcome.
"Popkiss, my boy,"
he called, coming forward to greet the professor.
"What a beautiful surprise. Are these your famous Supercar friends from America?"
Popkiss made the introductions and then noticed the item on which Gessler had been working. It was a huge doll, standing nearly 3 feet in height. Its features were beautifully constructed, and it appeared at first glance to be alive.
"Aha!"
chuckled the old clockmaker.
"You like my pretty Johanna, eh? For 3 years I've been constructing her. Now she nears completion.
It's marvellous, infused Mike, studying the doll closely. Fantastic. She looks as though she could get right up and walk out of here.
She could, Mr. Mercury, grinned Gessler. She has one of the finest clockwork motors in the world. At the turn of a key, I can make Joanna walk a mile over the roughest country. She can run, too, and soon, when she is finished, she will be able to speak over 100 different words in 2 languages.
Amazing, Professor Popkiss replied. You have not lost any of your craftsmanship, Kurt.
No, Popkiss,
replied the old man.
But I have run into a slight technical problem. I told you she will be able to speak, but not until I find a way to amplify her voice.
With that, the clockmaker pressed a small switch and a stream of words came from the doll, but the sounds were so soft it was almost impossible to hear them.
Do you see the problem, Popkiss?
Gessler asked, his brow furrowing deeply.
She's perfect apart from her voice. I am at a loss to know what to do.
Couldn't you help, Prof? Mike asked, knowing the brilliant scientist's capabilities. If you can do half the work in designing a machine like Supercar, you must be able to amplify a doll's voice.
Would you look at my Joanna, Popkiss? Gessler prompted. I'd be very grateful to you.
Well, I don't know much about toys, Kurt, said the professor in his modest way, but I'll certainly do all I can to help. For the next 2 days, Professor Popkiss, who had called in the additional services of Dr. Beaker, worked with Kurt Gessler in the little clock shop. Mike, Jimmy and Mitch spent their time enjoying the magnificent scenery of the Swiss countryside and in sledging and skiing. A special feature of the 2 happy days was when Mike took Jimmy on the Alpine Railway, which wound and twisted to a lofty height up one of the mountains. Then, at supper on the 3rd day of their visit to Switzerland, Professor Popkiss and Dr. Beaker announced that they had completed work on the doll.
Tomorrow morning we are going to give it its final test, beamed Popkiss. I want you all to be outside the cottage. Yes, quite so, went on Dr. Beaker. The Professor, Mr. Gessler and I will start the doll at the village and it will travel up here and speak to you. Gee, that's great, enthused Jimmy. I can't wait for tomorrow.
The next morning, as Beaker had said, the doll was wound up and began its journey up the valley. Walking, running, it travelled sure-footedly over the snow and ice. Popkiss and Beaker watched in silent amazement. The doll was a piece of machine perfection. Outside her cottage, Heidi Popkiss waited with Mike, Jimmy and Mitch. Then the doll appeared. It walked right up to the group, who stood back in wonder, for never had they seen such a lifelike doll. Suddenly, Joanna's mouth opened.
Good morning,
she cried, and the voice was like a clap of thunder. It echoed around the mountains and valleys, booming out a stream of microphonic words. Mike put his hands to his ears to muffle the blaring noise, but before his palms clamped tight to his head, he heard another sound, a distant, growling rumble. Like the sound of nearing drummers, the new noise echoed over the white mountains and snowfields. Avalanche! Mike cried, turning to gaze upwards in alarm at the towering peaks above them. The doll's voice has started a huge snowfall! The powdery haze of cascading snow crumbled down from the peak of the mountain up which the railway wound. From their position, Jimmy and Mike could see the plunging, tumbling cloud of whiteness, gathering, dislodging, plummeting other drifts of ice and snow towards the rail tracks which wound around the mountain like steel bands. Look, Mike! Jimmy shouted above the increasing roar of the avalanche. A train! Mike had seen it at the same moment, the small engine chugging down the mountainside, heading straight into the path of the snowfall. Next second, Mike Mercury was running like a hare towards Supercar. He knew that the driver of the train could not stop in time. At emergency boost, Supercar's powerful engines roared into life, and Mike steered the wonder machine of the age over the snow, scorching the white-coated valley. Up he climbed in a desperate race against time. He had to stop the train before it reached the avalanche. Already the track was covered by the giant fall of snow as Mike zoomed towards the locomotive. The driver had seen the danger, but the steep descent and the weight of the coaches in tow had made his brakes almost useless. Then Mike was there, flying Supercar in front of the engine's boiler, matching the train's speed. Slowly at first, Mike throttled back the powerful motors of Supercar. Sweat poured from his brow as he changed the boosters to reverse thrust, and the sleek craft shuddered at the impact against the train. Ahead the snow was piling, burying, crunching down over the track. Would Mike be able to stop the train in time? He just had to. If he failed, the engine would smash into the impenetrable bank of white danger that grew with each passing minute. Supercar's motors screamed as the revolutions mounted, Mike's hands shuddering beneath the protesting controls. Nearer, ever closer, the locomotive charged Supercar towards the increasing wall of snow. Then Mike could feel the rate of descent decreasing. Supercar was winning. The engine's brakes were holding, slowing the train. 30 feet from the Avalanche's swelling path, the Alpine train finally came to a halt. But Mike knew 30 feet would not be enough. The gap had to be widened to avoid the eventual limit of the cascading snowfall. Supercar eased the train back, foot by foot, yard by yard, up the track, until Mike was sure all was safe. It took a long time to clear the tracks, but Supercar's scorching exhausts quickened the work. Kurt Gessler retrieved the doll. They had amplified the machine's voice, but to such an extent that danger threatened at each word. Simple adjustments were made, and when Supercar and its intrepid team left Switzerland, Kurt Gessler had the best doll in the world. But he had to admit that Supercar was the finest machine of all. "Say, Prof," chuckled Mike on the way home, "where do we put 30 cuckoo clocks?" "I don't know, Mike," answered Popkiss, winking broadly at Jimmy. "But we just couldn't refuse the gift Kurt Gessler gave us for helping him." Then suddenly, from Supercar's boot, a chorus of sound burst forth. "Cuckoo! Cuckoo! Cuckoo!" "Oh no!" groaned Jimmy. "It's 12 o'clock!"